Okay, so what's the Japanese reaction to how do they develop? One of the things Japan's able to do is they're able to industrialize better than anyone else in East Asia. And as such a great industrialization nation, they will they'll be much more successful. And you're going to see in the early 1900s and the early 20th century, they'll be much more powerful than anybody else in East Asia. One of the things they do is they have state, that means government, state-sponsored industrialization. They need capital. Why? Well, they've been predominantly a feudal nation, agricultural nation up to this point, and they need capital. They need money. They're unfamiliar with some of these new industrial technologies. And they want someone, that being the government, to restrain any foreign advisors. In other words, they don't want other nations coming in and telling them what to do. And you're going to see at least part of that is due to the fact that they do believe in themselves as being superior to other surrounding nations. Private enterprise, though, don't let me overstate it. While it is state-sponsored industry, they do have private enterprise, which helps out the economy. One of the things that comes out of this private enterprise, there are huge industrial corporations called, and I'm not sure how to say this, ZAIBATSU. And what I mean is these companies will, rather than just making cars, they'll make, if they, like, say Ford Motor, it would be they would make ships, and they would provide you your children's education, and they would provide your housing, and your company would be your town, your life, everything. So these large corporations will take over and be quite powerful in Japan. Okay. Also, it's difficult to industrialize in Japan because Japan's a resource poor nation. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that Japan lacks the steel, the coal, some of the raw materials it needs. So if Japan wants to industrialize, it always has to be exporting goods to buy the raw materials it needs to be an industrial nation. Hear that. They've got to be exporting clothes early on, toys, and in the late 1900s, cars, in order to be able to buy the things to make those machines. It's at a disadvantage because it must import raw materials. Women are frequently treated badly and enslaved. If you guys remember the cotton mechanization DBQ we read, it talked about how imagine in the West being able to get away with having girls work in your factory for an entire year and not pay them. You think anybody would put up with that? No way they would put up with that, but you do in Japan. And labor is not able to organize like it is in the West, so it ends up with poor working conditions, frequently poor working conditions in Japan. So what kind of things did Japan embrace from the West, and what kind of things did they reject? Well, they embraced some things of the West, such as clothing, haircuts, hygiene, and medicine. I don't know if you guys can see it on your computer screen, but you can see these are advertisements for cigarettes and looks like a crock pot or something. Notice they've got giving them Western haircuts, sort of a uniquely Japanese kind of thing to combine some aspects of the West and the hair and all and the makeup, and then also still maintain a Japanese style dress. They ignored some things of the West. For instance, they do not convert in large numbers to Christianity. They keep their manners. They think Westerners are rude, and they encourage Shintoism, the Japanese religion. Isn't it ironic? The Japanese feel the Western Europeans are rude to each other, while meantime in Russia, they thought the Westerners were very polite to each other. Remember that? If you remember back under Peter the Great, it's one of the things he says is he wants the Russians to start talking nicer to each other like the people of Eastern Europe, or not Eastern Europe, I'm sorry, Western Europe, like the people of Western Europe. So, this strain of modernization, what do I mean by that? Well, Japan's got conflicts. It's got its traditions, but it's got these new industrial ways. So how does it reconcile the two? How does it bring these two together? So what they do is they say, listen, we're going to adopt the things that are good about the West, but we're going to reject the things we see bad. And one of the things we're going to continue to do is have obedience and harmony that the West lacks. In other words, we're going to be obedient to the system. We're going to get along in ways that Western countries do not. They are going to preserve vehemently their independence and dignity in this hostile world. What China's going to go through, where it gets little parts of it get bit off from by Europeans. Remember that? Do you remember the picture of the pie with the Europeans all cutting it up? Japan's not going to let that happen to itself. Okay? And there will be a tradition of both superiority of Japanese culture and deference to rulers. Now, deference simply means you do what rulers tell you to. You do what the boss tells you to, what the teacher, what the national leader, in this case the emperor, does. And that will allow them to avoid the revolutions of the West. There will be some reforms, the Meiji reforms, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. And also Japan will have intense repression of dissent. By that I mean they will put down anybody who disagrees. Society will frown on anybody disagreeing, and they will put this down. Last slide. What were 3 results of Russian and Japanese actions during this time? Big picture here. Russia extended its influence deeper into Asia and into Europe. They've really entered European politics after the defeat of Napoleon. They've been pretty isolationist up till Napoleon attacks them in 1812. And then they decide they got to get involved in what's going on in Europe. Number 2, Japan's economic and military strength gave it a unique position in the East. One of the things you're going to see is post-World War I, Japan will not sit on the sidelines during World War I, but will get heavily involved in East Asia, and will start to take over large sections of East Asia. And number 3, there'll be growing competition between Europe, the emerging United States, Japan, and Russia. Japan starts to colonize in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century, and that will scare the heck out of Europe and the United States. In fact, it will come to be known as the Yellow Peril. Nations are colonizing, and they're not from Europe, and that scares the Europeans. They compete with each other, but implicitly they're okay with other European nations taking on colonies. These new places taking on colonies, not so much. All right, that ends chapter 27. Thank you.